She thought first class was her domain, until one mistake turned her flight into a public downfall. She never saw coming. Sarah Whitmore walked confidently through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, her expensive carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. She had taken this trip so many times before, Dallas to Washington, D.C., always in first class, always expecting the best. For Sarah, flying wasn't just about getting somewhere. It was about comfort, about exclusivity. She loved the priority boarding, the polite smiles from the flight attendants, the complimentary champagne. First class wasn't just about better seats. It was about being around the right kind of people. So, when she reached her assigned seat and saw a black man in a tailored navy blue suit already seated beside her, she hesitated, just for a second. He had an air of quiet confidence, absorbed in whatever was on his laptop, his fingers typing smoothly across the keyboard. Sarah's lips tightened. This wasn't what she expected in first class. She set her designer tote down with just a little extra force, a silent expression of her dissatisfaction, and took her seat. The man didn't even look up. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But still, something about him bothered her. Her discomfort grew as she stole small glances at him. He seemed completely at ease, like he belonged there. That, for some reason, made her even more irritated. Finally, she decided to say something. She leaned slightly toward him, just enough to make her presence known. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but firm. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The man barely looked up from his laptop. His response was short, calm, unwavering. "Yes." That was it. No explanation, no details, just yes. Sarah frowned slightly. People in first class usually introduced themselves, made small talk, or at least acknowledged each other. But this man, he wasn't playing along, still unsatisfied. She looked around, catching the eye of a nearby flight attendant. Emily Jacobs, a young woman in her early 30s, had been helping passengers a few rows ahead. Noticing Sarah's gesture, she walked over with a polite smile. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Sarah forced a small chuckle, as if she found the situation amusing. "I think there's been a mix-up," she said lightly. "I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Emily glanced at the man, who finally paused his typing and looked up. His face was unreadable, calm, but sharp, like someone who had seen this before. The flight attendant quickly pulled up the passenger list on her tablet, scanning the names and seat assignments. After a few moments, she nodded. "Actually, Mr. Carter is in the correct seat," she said, looking back at Sarah. "You're in 2A, and he's in 2B. Sarah blinked. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the armrest. "Oh, that's odd," she said with a forced laugh. "Are you sure?" Emily gave a polite but firm nod. "Yes, ma'am. Everything looks correct." For a split second, Sarah's carefully controlled expression faltered, but she quickly smoothed it over with a tight smile. "Well," she exhaled, sitting back, "I suppose mistakes happen." Emily hesitated, sensing the tension, but after a moment, she nodded and walked away. Sarah, however, wasn't done. She sat stiffly, arms crossed, her mind racing. She had flown first class for decades, and never, not once, had she been put in a situation like this. Her breathing became shallow, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She wasn't the type to just sit back and accept things, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. Sarah sat rigidly in her seat, fingers tapping restlessly on her knee. She couldn't focus. Every part of her wanted to ignore the man beside her, but her discomfort refused to fade. She had been flying first class for years, and she had never felt like this before. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong. He wasn't talking too loud. He wasn't invading her space. He wasn't being disruptive. But still, he didn't belong here. She pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded overhead. A moment later, Emily returned, still smiling professionally. "Ma'am, is there something I can help you with?" Sarah lowered her voice, keeping it carefully measured. "I'd like to request a seat change." Emily blinked. "Oh, is there a problem with your seat?" Sarah hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. She couldn't say what she was really thinking. Instead, she tilted her head slightly toward Mr. Carter, lowering her voice even further. I don't feel comfortable sitting here." Emily's polite expression stiffened slightly, though she didn't let it show. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am," she said, glancing quickly at Mr. Carter, who had now paused his typing again. "If there's a technical issue with the seat, I'd be happy to—" "No," Sarah interrupted, shaking her head quickly. "It's not the seat. I'd rather sit somewhere else." Emily's fingers moved swiftly over her tablet, checking the seating chart. After a few moments, she looked up. "I'm afraid we're at full capacity today, ma'am. There are no open first-class seats available." Sarah's stomach twisted. Emily smiled apologetically. "I can check if there are any open seats in economy." Sarah stiffened. Economy? As if that was even an option. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "That's not going to work." Emily didn't react, though Sarah noticed a small shift in her demeanor, just the slightest bit less accommodating. "In that case, ma'am," she said gently but firmly, "I hope you don't mind staying in your assigned seat." Sarah forced a thin-lipped smile. "I suppose I have no choice." Emily gave a polite nod and walked away, but Sarah could barely hear her footsteps. Her ears were ringing. The man beside her, Mr. Carter, hadn't said a word through the entire exchange. He wasn't reacting. He wasn't acknowledging her, and that infuriated her. She wanted him to say something, to defend himself, to at least act uncomfortable. But instead, he simply went back to his laptop, typing, as if she didn't exist. Sarah clenched her fists in her lap. This wasn't over. She exhaled sharply and pressed the call button again. The soft chime rang out again. This time there was a noticeable pause before Emily returned. Her smile was still there, but now there was something else behind it. Caution. "Ma'am," she said, her tone still polite, but now slightly firmer. "How can I assist you?" Sarah sat up straighter, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I need to speak to someone in charge." Her voice was low, but insistent. Emily's expression didn't change. "I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight, ma'am. Is there something specific you need?" Sarah inhaled slowly, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make it seem serious. And then she said the words that changed everything. "I don't feel safe." The entire mood of the cabin shifted. Emily's smile disappeared. Passengers nearby, who had been pretending not to listen, suddenly stopped moving. Mr. Carter finally looked up. His fingers paused over his keyboard. Across the aisle, an older gentleman wearing a Bluetooth earpiece sighed and muttered under his breath. "Here we go." Emily straightened, her shoulders tight now. Her voice was careful. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but can you clarify what you mean?" Sarah kept her expression neutral, playing the role carefully. "I'm not saying anything specific," she said, keeping her voice calm, measured. I don't feel comfortable, that's all." It was a simple statement, a calculated one. She didn't accuse him of anything directly. She didn't need to. The words carried their own implications. The whispers in the cabin grew louder. The young woman sitting a few rows back lifted her phone slightly, as if texting. But Sarah caught the slight angle of the camera. She was recording. Emily's posture stiffened further. Her voice, still professional, had lost any trace of patience. "Just to clarify," she said slowly, "are you saying you feel threatened?" Sarah paused, letting the silence stretch, just for a beat too long. Then she gave the smallest shrug. "I'm not saying that." Another pause. Then, in the same breath, she added, "I just think it would be best if someone else took this seat." Across the aisle, the businessman with the Bluetooth let out a short chuckle. The young woman recording tilted her phone slightly, making sure she got the shot. Sarah felt the shift in the air. For the first time, she sensed that things weren't going the way she had planned. Emily let out a slow breath, glancing briefly at Mr. Carter. He still hadn't said a word. Then she turned back to Sarah. Her voice was firmer now. "Ma'am, I already checked, and there are no available first-class seats." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "And in coach?" Emily hesitated. "There are 2 open seats in economy." Sarah sat up straighter, her confidence returning. "Perfect. He can take one of them." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Emily didn't blink. Her voice, even steadier now. "Ma'am, just so I understand, you're asking me to remove a paying passenger from his first-class seat and send him to economy because you don't want to sit next to him?" Sarah gave a tight nod. "Yes." Emily exhaled through her nose, then folded her hands in front of her. Her next words landed like a hammer. "That won't be happening." Sarah's face flushed. "Excuse me?" Emily didn't waver. "Mr. Carter has a first-class ticket just like you. He is in his assigned seat. I cannot, and will not, ask him to move." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. She had expected sympathy. She had expected someone, the flight attendant, the passengers, anyone, to take her side. Instead, the young woman with the phone zoomed in on her face. Across the aisle, the businessman shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." Sarah clenched her fists. This was not how it was supposed to go. Sarah felt the heat rising to her face. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be the one calling the shots, the respected, well-traveled woman whose concerns would be taken seriously. Instead, she was the one being challenged. Her nails dug into the armrest as she sat up straighter. Her voice came out sharp, controlled, but cracking underneath. "This is ridiculous." She kept her voice low, but the anger was there. "I am simply asking for the same courtesy that would be extended to anyone else who feels uncomfortable. I have the right to request a seat change." Emily didn't flinch, her voice steady. "Ma'am, you are asking me to remove a passenger from first class for no valid reason. That is not an accommodation. That is discrimination." A sharp silence followed. A few rows back, someone let out a low whistle. Sarah's stomach twisted, her fingers curled into her lap. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were open conversations now. And worst of all, everyone was looking at her. Emily straightened her shoulders. Her voice, firmer now. "Ma'am, we are about to taxi. If you cannot remain seated and follow flight crew instructions, I will have to ask you to deplane." Sarah froze. "What?" Emily's polite smile was gone. Her next words were final. "You have 2 options. You can stay in your assigned seat and remain quiet for the duration of the flight, or you can leave the plane. A few passengers clapped softly. Sarah's breath hitched. She was losing. She opened her mouth to argue, to fight back, to demand to speak to someone higher up. But before she could say another word, the man beside her, the one who had stayed silent this entire time, finally moved. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a leather case, flipped it open, and just like that, everything changed. A gold FBI badge gleamed under the cabin lights. The air in the plane shifted instantly. Passengers gasped. Someone in the back chuckled in disbelief. The young woman recording? She zoomed in immediately. Mr. Carter, who had barely spoken a word up until now, turned his head slowly and looked at Sarah, his expression calm, too calm. And then, in a voice that was smooth, even unreadable, he asked, "Ma'am, would you like to file an official complaint?" Sarah couldn't breathe. He didn't blink. He didn't smirk. He just waited. For the first time, she felt truly trapped. The weight of the moment settled over the cabin like a thick fog. Sarah sat completely still, her breath caught in her throat. She had just spent the last 20 minutes trying to get this man removed from his seat, implying he was a problem, a threat. And now, he was an FBI agent. Her fingers trembled in her lap. This couldn't be happening. The badge was still there, glinting under the dim cabin lights. And then, he spoke again. "You said you felt uncomfortable," Mr. Carter said, his voice as smooth as ever. "That's a serious claim on a federal flight. If you believe I've done something inappropriate, I'd be happy to take your statement. Right here, right now." Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. She could feel every single person in first class watching her. The businessman across the aisle, grinning, the woman recording, still filming, Emily, the flight attendant, standing with her arms crossed, waiting. Sarah tried to speak, but all that came out was a weak, strangled sound. Mr. Carter tilted his head slightly. "No complaint?" he asked, almost amused. Sarah barely managed to shake her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No." A beat of silence, then, slowly, he closed his badge, tucked it back into his jacket, and, just like that, went back to his laptop, as if she didn't exist. A few passengers murmured in approval. The businessman across the aisle smirked and went back to his newspaper. And the young woman with the phone, she was already typing. Sarah felt sick. Her reputation, her authority, it was slipping through her fingers. She had spent years carefully curating her image. She was respected, well-connected. People listened to her. But now she was just a woman who had tried to pull a power move on the wrong person, and people had seen it. People had recorded it. Her heart pounded as she snuck a glance at the young woman's screen. Her stomach dropped. The video was already online. The caption? "Racist woman tries to remove black man from first class, then learns he's FBI." Sarah's hands went ice cold. The flight wasn't even in the air yet. And somehow, she had already lost. Sarah's fingers tightened around the armrest as the flight took off. She felt exposed, like a spotlight was shining directly on her, even though no one was looking at her anymore. They didn't need to. The damage was already done. Her phone, sitting inside her purse, vibrated once, then twice, then over and over again. She hesitated, then slowly pulled it out. Her name was already trending. Her video had been online for less than 10 minutes, and it had already racked up thousands of views. She tapped on the comments. Karma is so sweet. This lady really thought she could get away with it. Imagine trying to ruin someone's flight and ending up ruining your own life instead. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just going to blow over by the time the plane landed in Washington. The video had over 1 million views. She barely made it to the terminal before she saw the reporters. Not a huge crowd, not yet, but enough. A woman in a navy blazer stood near baggage claim, holding a microphone, reading from her phone. The now viral video shows an unidentified woman attempting to have an FBI agent removed from first class, citing discomfort. The clip has gained over 1 million views in just a few hours. Sarah stopped breathing. 1 million. That was impossible. She turned quickly, hoping no one had recognized her. But it was too late. One of the reporters locked eyes with her. The woman's face lit up. Wait, that's her. Sarah spun around and walked as fast as she could toward the exit. Her phone buzzed violently in her hand. Missed calls, text messages, alerts. She shoved past a group of travelers, nearly stumbling onto the curb. A taxi slowed down in front of her, and she practically threw herself into the back seat. Drive, now. The driver raised an eyebrow, but pulled away from the curb. Sarah's hands shook as she checked her messages. One from her sister, one from her friend, and one from a number she didn't recognize. Her stomach dropped. She hesitated, then swiped to answer. Hello? A brief silence. Then, a clipped, professional voice. Miss Whitmore, this is James Rollins, chair of the Marston Foundation. Sarah's throat went dry. She'd been a board member at the Marston Foundation for years, a prestigious, well-respected charity organization that prided itself on diversity and inclusion, and she already knew what this call was about. James didn't wait for her to speak. I assume you're aware of the situation? She swallowed. James, we're going to need you to step down. Sarah's body went numb. Wait, what? James, this is being taken out of context. His voice stayed flat. The board disagrees. We'll issue a public statement by morning. We expect your resignation by then. Click. The call was over. Sarah lowered her phone slowly. She had spent decades building a reputation, carefully crafting an image. And in one afternoon, it was gone. She let out a shaky breath. This wasn't something she could spin. This wasn't something she could control. This was something she had done. To herself. And now, she had to live with it. Meanwhile, Mr. Carter? By now he was probably in a meeting somewhere, completely unbothered. Because for him, this had been just another Tuesday.